Hello, and welcome back to Miss History and part 6 of the Mary Surratt series. And if you've missed the first 5, I'll put them in the description. I'll put a link up here. And you can catch up if you want, or if you don't want to and you just want to watch this one, that's fine too. Because in part 5, I talked about all of the roles of those involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln, questioned how the police knew to search Mary's boarding house, and more importantly, why did Mary expect the house to be searched in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1865? And now we continue with the escape of Booth and the arrests of those involved. So, if you'll remember in the last episode, right, Booth assassinates Lincoln, escapes the theater, starts riding out of town toward Virginia. He would catch up with Herold, David Herold, and the two would bribe their way out of D.C. on the night of the assassination. They would arrive at the tavern in Surrattsville to collect the items left there during the kidnapping plot, and then they would head south again. And in the early morning hours of April 15th, 1865, the two would stop at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd for treatment of Booth's leg, and then they would continue south toward Virginia. April 15th, 1865, Booth and Herold would arrive at the home of Samuel Cox in the early morning hours, where they would hide in the woods nearby. Cox would then contact his foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, who was a Confederate agent in charge of spy operations in southern Maryland. So then Booth would continue to hide out in the woods until he could safely cross the Potomac into Virginia, because the War Department had advertised a $100,000 reward for any information that would lead to the arrest of Booth and his co-conspirators. Federal troops would search the rural area, woods, and swamps in the days following the assassination of Lincoln. On April 18th, 1865, mourners would wait in long lines to view the slain president as his body lay in state. The nation would come together to mourn and be present for the funeral of Lincoln, even sleeping on blankets on the Capitol building lawns. Frederick Douglass would call the assassination an unspeakable calamity. Newspapers would call Booth an accursed devil, monster, madman, and wretched fiend. Whatever happened to language? People in the North who had photos of Booth from his stage days would throw them out, burn them, crumble up the photos, whatever, just to get rid of them. And even in the South, there would be sorrow about the death of Lincoln. The mayor and city council in Savannah, Georgia, would address a crowd and express their indignation. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnson would call Booth's act a disgrace to the age, and Robert E. Lee would also express his regret of Lincoln's death at the hands of Booth. The grief wasn't everywhere, and a man in New York City actually got attacked for saying it served old Abe right. In the South, Lincoln was hated as much in death as he was in life, and Booth, in some areas, was viewed as a hero. Booth would continue to hide out in Maryland, and then he would read accounts of all of the nationwide mourning that was being reported in the newspapers that were being brought to him by Jones. On April 20th, 1865, he knew of the arrests of his co-conspirators, which we'll cover next episode, including Mary, Powell, Arnold, and O'Laughlin, and he would be surprised to find very little public sympathy for what he had done, even from anti-Lincoln newspapers. In the San Francisco Chronicle, it was written, "Booth has simply carried out what secession politicians and journalists have been for years expressing in words, who have denounced the president as a tyrant, a despot, and a usurper, hinted at and virtually recommended. Many would blame the critics of Lincoln for Booth's attack." On April 21st, 1865, Booth would write in his journal, "For 6 months we worked to capture, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. I can never repent it, though we hated to kill. I don't think you did, Booth. Crazy man. That same day, April 21st, a 9-car funeral train with Lincoln's body would depart Washington, D.C. en route to Springfield, Illinois. The train would have stops in Harrisburg. The train would stop in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at 8:20 p.m. And around that same time, Booth and Herold were given a boat and a compass by Jones to cross the Potomac into Virginia. Before they got on the boat to cross the river, they would kill their horses, including the one that Booth would rent from Pumphrey. Guess he's not getting his money back, or his horse, as they were no longer needed. However, instead of going to Virginia, the pair would take a wrong turn at a bend in the river and end up back in Maryland on April 22nd. But as it turns out, Herold would know the area, recognize a farm that belonged to a known Confederate sympathizer who would bring them to his son-in-law, Colonel John J. Hughes. Hughes would give them food and allow them a place to stay until nightfall, when they would again cross the river. Booth would write in his journal, "With every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant that they ever knew, am looked upon as a common cutthroat." Yes, you were. Booth and Herold would make it to Virginia in the pre-dawn hours of April 23rd, 1865, where they would make contact with Thomas Harbin. Harbin would take them to another Confederate agent, William Bryant, who then would give them fresh horses. So we come back to the question of how the agents knew to search Mary's boarding house. And it has been concluded by historians that it was maybe a Department of War employee, Daniel Gleason, and a friend of Weichman, who alerted the federal authorities of the Confederate activities at the Surratt house. However, another historian, Roy Chamley, disagrees, saying that there is evidence that Gleason didn't tell the police about his suspicions of Weichman for several days. So, you remember Weichman and Houlihan deciding to go to Detective McDevitt. On the morning of April 15th, 1865, Weichman would announce that he was going to go to the police and tell them everything he knew about Booth, though he wasn't exactly sure what he did know. And he would mention to Mary and the others at the house that there was bound to be further investigation of the house and the residence. So Anna would tell Weichman to stop talking, and that as far as she was concerned, Lincoln was no worse than the meanest, can't say that word on YouTube, in the army. Weichman would say later that he told her she would soon find out differently. Early in the investigation, eyewitness testimony and other pieces of evidence since the night of the assassination would link Booth and his conspirators to Mary's boarding house. Shocking. There would be an uncoordinated effort between the Union Army and the Washington Metropolitan Police, which would prevent organization of data and would make for a less effective coordination and analysis of the evidence because, nobody wants to share. That said, both agencies would see a pattern linking the events of April 14th, 1865 with John Jr., who both agencies would have files on due to his rebel courier activities. However, it would be the disorganization and competition between the agencies that would create several delays on many fronts and eventually lead to a loss of evidence. These delays could probably have given Mary time to hide or destroy any evidence of her or John's part in the conspiracy. Federal soldiers would again go to the boarding house late on April 17th, 1865, based on information given by Weichman, Houlihan, and that of a recently hired servant, Susan Jackson. Susan would tell Provost Marshal Henry H. Wells, the commander of an Army investigative unit, that 3 mysterious men had come to the boarding house after the assassination and that there were whispers that John Jr. was with Booth at the theater. The men would then get in a buggy after one had changed clothes and they left. Susan was likely scared, confused, or absolutely misunderstood what was happening, as she was mistaken about the date where the 3 men that she heard were actually Weichman, Houlihan, and Detective McDevitt when McDevitt came to the home late on the morning hours of April 15th to meet with Weichman and Houlihan. Unfortunately for Mary, this was a big deal, as Susan's statements would have the government officials now not only suspecting John Jr. of being involved, but Mary as well. Weichman would give long statements about what he had seen over the past several months and would identify not only Booth, but also David Herold, George Astorot, Lewis Powell, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and John Jr. He was not yet able to accept that Mary may have been a part of the plot as well. In his statements and affidavits, he would say that Mary welcoming Booth was unfortunate and actually disrupted the normally pleasant home. It would be a period of time before Weichman would connect the events and ultimately expose Mary as one of the important fellow conspirators of Booth. Based on the statements given by Susan and the other evidence, Colonel Wells would command a detail of armed guards and officers to the boarding house on April 17, 1865, with orders to arrest Mary Surratt and anyone else in the house with her. Armed officers and guards would surround the boarding house on H Street, and shortly before 11 that evening, 5 officers would climb the stairs and knock on the door, led by Eli DeVore. An open window with a curtain blocking it would lead the officers to hear Mary ask, "Is that you, Mr. Kirby?" To which DeVore would reply, "No, madam, I want this door opened," while another officer would write down the name Kirby, which is a new name. Upon entering the house, DeVore would notice that Mary seemed calm as she identified herself as the widow of John H. Surratt Sr. and the mother of John H. Surratt Jr., and she did not seem at all surprised or concerned that the officers appeared at her home at such a late hour. She would lead them to the parlor on the second floor where Anna, Nora, and Olivia were sitting. Major H.W. Smith would question who the ladies were. Mary would introduce them as officers would move to search the house for any other residents. Smith would tell the women that they were all being taken to General Christopher C. Ager's office for interrogation, while the other officers rounded up the remaining residents, of which the Hoolahans were not a part of, having moved out of the home the day before. Anna would become emotional, because it sounds like she was really emotional, and she would shout out, "Oh, mother, think of being taken down there for such a crime." This would lead Mary to place her arms around Anna's neck and whisper something in her ear that none of the officers heard. Whatever she told Anna, Anna was able to regain composure, which surprised Smith, who also noted that Mary never once asked why they were being arrested. While the women sat in the parlor awaiting a carriage to take them to be interrogated, Smith would tell Mary that due to the rain, she might like additional clothing for the ride. When Mary made a move to go to her room, she was informed by Smith that the house was under suspicion and that he must accompany her wherever she went. Detective John Clairvaux would guard the other ladies in the parlor to see that no papers were destroyed and that no communication passed between the ladies. Detectives Richard Morgan and another man named Sampson would arrive to then assist. The house was carefully searched. Every room in the house. This time, officers took their time to record details of the search and to collect possible evidence. Captain W.M. Werbeskirch would search Mary's room and find a photo of Booth hidden behind another photograph. Pictures of Confederate leaders, including Jefferson Davis, a bullet mold, and percussion caps used to ignite gunpowder, were also found in her room. In addition to the odd items found in her room of the boarding house, other items were retrieved from around the house, including miscellaneous papers, letters, lithographs, and cartes de visite of mostly Confederate generals, one of which was a Confederate flag with the inscription, "Thus will it ever be with tyrants, Virginia, the mighty sic semper tyrannis," the same Latin phrase Booth used upon his escape from the theater. Prior to the arrival of the carriage, Mary would ask Smith if she could kneel and pray, which he didn't have a problem with. But just as she knelt to the floor, the sound of footsteps could be heard on the front steps, and Wermersmith and Morgan would hide behind the door, pistols drawn, expecting it to be the mysterious Mr. Kirby. The door was opened at the first knock, and this would be the knock that would be the unraveling of Booth's plot and Mary's fate to the gallows. The man who stood in the entryway was tall, muscular, and grimy, holding a pickaxe on his shoulder, and he seemed to be surprised to be greeted by Smith with a pistol in his hand. The mystery man said, "I guess I am mistaken," and the door would be shut behind him, trapping him in the entryway. Morgan would ask, "Whom do you want to see?" And the man replied, "Mrs. Surratt." He was told, "Then you are right. Walk in." The man, wearing a dark gray coat, dark pants, and a cap made from a sleeve of his shirt, because in that day it was inappropriate, I guess, for men to be out in public without a hat on their head, and he had made one out of a sleeve. But he was noted to be full of mud up to his knees nearly. His clothing did arouse suspicion due to the good quality of them. His pickaxe seemed to have never been used, and his hands were well manicured and not calloused. Mary would deny knowing the man, who appeared and later claimed that her extremely poor eyesight and the darkness of the room prevented her from recognizing him. He would be identified later as Lewis Payne. Interesting to note is that he was standing underneath a bright light 5 feet from her when she made her statement that she didn't know who he was, and then said, "Oh, my poor eyesight," and it was dark. Was it? Payne, would be arrested along with Mary and the other ladies. Found in his possession was a box of pistol cartridges, a compass, hair pomade, a brush and comb, 2 handkerchiefs, and a copy of his oath of allegiance signed L. Payne. Though he claimed to be poor, barely making even $1 a day digging ditches, he had $25 in his pocket. Powell would be positively identified twice on April 18th, 1865, once by William Bell and later by Augustus Seward. It's not really known where Powell had been between the attack on Seward and the time he showed up at Mary's boarding house, but it is speculated that he was hiding in either a cemetery, even a tree for 3 days, a marble burial vault, or he was just simply walking the streets of D.C. What is known is that his overcoat was found discarded near Fort Bunker Hill, which contained his riding gloves, a false mustache, and a piece of paper with a woman's name and hotel room number on it. He didn't know the streets of D.C., didn't know what escape route was, and realized that Herold and Booth had pretty much abandoned him and left him to his own devices in D.C. Oh, great. So, the only place he knew where to end up was Mary's boarding house. He knew where that was. So, yeah. Unfortunate for everybody. Or fortunate. Anyway, what of the other conspirators? I'm going to get to them in the next part, as I'm trying to keep the history and the story interesting while also keeping them short enough that you'll watch them. If you would like to catch up on this series and you're not caught up, you can do that here. If you just want to watch other MysHistory videos, you can also do that over here. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Give this video a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next part.